Sure. Okay. Where is my mic that he can't?
You see like a circular like disc up there?
Yeah, it used to be like a white disc, right?
There should be like a black disc.
Oh, the one that's like right in front?
Yeah, that's the microphone.
This thing?
No, to the
Does
right.
it look like?
Other right. My right.
Oh, it's right here.
It's like clipped onto the.
Click on, yeah, that's the microphone.
Oh, this thing.
That's the
Okay.
microphone?
I think you're right. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
I had to get my engineering students to help me.
Much better. Now I understand. Yes.
Okay, great.
Now it's clear.
Whew. Thank you. Okay, well, let's we can get started. Some other kids might be filtering in, but you know, it's between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So we got about 20 of the 30 that are usually here. So it's a pretty good turnout for this class. So do you want to start with an introduction? How do you usually start?
Okay. Well, first of all, let me just ask, what is this class?
This is an introductory to psychology class.
Oh, an intro to psych class. Okay, very good.
Yeah.
So what did you tell them about me?
So I have been lecturing about you since 2020, when I first learned your name, when I was working at Pennsylvania Psychiatric Institute, where I work part-time. I'm an adjunct. So, I hustle. I have like 5 different places I work, where a woman requested you personally for an exorcism. And that was during early pandemic. So I don't think we were letting anyone in at that time. And I went home and Googled you and was super excited because you looked exactly like how I thought you would. And I was like, oh, wow, it's like, this is still a thing because I'm not, part of the church. So I didn't, don't know anything. And when we talk about, there's 4 ways that we can determine mental illness according to the APA. And one is to have us consider cultural beliefs. So we are permissive of, an auditory hallucination is when you hear someone talking if no one's in the room. But if it's God, sometimes we are permissive of that, depending on what God says. If God's telling you to kill people, we will 302 someone for that. So that's usually when your name comes up that, is this a delusion? Is this for real? Because it's sanctioned by the Catholic Church.
Okay, it's interesting that you brought that up about the voices that you hear, because it's exactly some research that I'm doing right now with another professor who actually is a matter of, we're trying to distinguish between schizophrenia voices and actual what you described as God's voices or spiritual voices. All right, let me start off with 2 things. The first is that the supernatural realm, the demonic realm, is real. It does exist. It's not imaginative, right? It's real. The second thing is, it's important to understand certain basic anthropology. A human person has a body, mind, spirit composite. It's the union of all 3, right? I'm not any one of the 3. I am the union of all 3, which means anything that happens on one level is going to have effects and ramifications on the other levels as well. Which it comes down to, basically, there is no such thing as an either or. It's not mental illness or demonic possession or vice versa, right? It's always going to be a combination of the 2. So the key becomes trying to figure out which is the root cause of the problem and which are the symptoms of the problem. So a person may be suffering from genuine mental illness, but demons certainly will take advantage of those and manipulate them for their own ends. On the other hand, there could be somebody who's dealing with real spiritual issues, but sometimes they will mimic mental illness symptoms to throw you off the track. So half the battle is, first of all, discovering which is the cause and which is the effect. What's the root cause of the problem? Then you know how to approach the issue. So that's basically what I have to do. And so as far as my own background is concerned, first of all, I was at one time the chaplain at the York Hospital. And while I was chaplain there, I said, well, York College is right across the street. I think I'll take some classes over there. And so I got my bachelor's degree in psychology there at York College. But then I moved on and got my master's degree and eventually my PhD at Capella University online. So it's been a wonderful trip, and I really enjoy it. But now, so it gives me the advantage of being able to approach these issues from both sides, both from the mental health issue and from the spiritual issue as well. So it's an investigative process. The person first comes to you and says, hey, I was laughing, was thinking about this. When the person comes to me and says, I need an exorcism, I think I'm possessed, the chances are they're not. They don't usually, that's not the way it generally works. But there are other ways in which we determine, whether it's a genuine mental illness or whether it's a spiritual attack. So I'd be open to questions on that. And anybody have any real questions I'd like to ask, I'd be happy to entertain those.
Yeah, we have a couple. First is, someone wants to know, is it physically and mentally exhausting to perform an exorcism? Is it like several hours? Is there physicality involved?
It can be. It depends on the case. It depends on the situation. Some cases are easier than others. Yes, some can be mentally draining. Some can be spiritually draining. So not all cases, but some, yes, some can be physically or spiritually draining. Yes, they can be, depending on the case.
Okay. I guess I want to ask too about, you said about with the schizophrenia voices and demons manipulating them. Is there a way that you can tell? I saw something about language that you put in your dissertation. If they're speaking a language they don't know, that's one key way to tell.
The church basically gives us 4 signs that we look for in terms of whether or not a person is actually possessed, right? Those signs are basically, 1, the person would have knowledge of or be able to speak in languages that they never studied, right? And that's a pretty good. I had a case one time of a man. He was born in Africa, but raised in the United States. And during the course of an exorcism, I began to ask him certain questions in Latin, and I ordered him to answer my questions only in English so that everyone there could understand the answers. And he answered every question correctly. So it was a pretty good indication. He had never studied Latin, and yet he was able to answer my questions. So this ability to speak and to know and to understand languages that they've never studied, that's one. The second is the ability to know what we would call occult knowledge. They know things that they would have no ability to know. There's no human way that they would be able to know the particular information. And a third one, and I'll give an interesting example on this one in a minute, 2 together, is what we would call an aversion to sacred objects. So I had a case one time of a woman who she would come to see me. The only time she could ever go into a church was when I said to her, I will see you in the church. And so we were in church one day. I was sitting in a pew. She was in a pew behind me. 2 of my team members were in a pew behind her, one of whom happened to be a medical doctor, a professor actually at Penn State Hershey Medical. But anyway, she had a bag with her that just had a relic of a saint in her bag. And during the course of my conversation with the person, this doctor just kind of leaned forward and gently placed this bag against the back of the pew in which the person was sitting. And she literally flew up out of the pew, down on the floor screaming, what was that? What did you do? What did you hit me with? So she reacted to a sacred object, but had no idea it was even there. So that was, a pretty good sign that, yeah, there's something demonic, something spiritual going on here. And the other one, and the fourth one becomes having what we would call supernatural or unnatural human abilities. Again, a case of a young woman who was possessed, had been freed, became repossessed, went into these trances or into these phases, and her mother had to take her to an emergency room one day, and she was at the hospital. They said it took 4 police officers to hold her down. And she was a young, petite Hispanic girl. And they gave her, and this is what they told me from the emergency room, they gave her tranquilizers that should have taken down an elephant, and it had no effect on her. And they stepped out of the room to kind of consult to decide what to do. They came back into the room and found her literally climbing up the wall. And that was, a pretty good indication that there was something unnatural going on here. That was definitely a sign of demonic possession. So again, we had to do another exorcism to free her. Much more difficult the second time than the first time. So those are the 4 signs that we look for, although they're not exclusive. Knowledge of other languages, aversion to sacred objects, occult knowledge of things that they have no access to, and then what we would call unnatural human abilities. Those are the things that we look for in our investigation of the case.
Okay, so that was actually one of the questions about a crucifix. So it sounds like that would fall under the sacred objects potentially.
Correct.
Okay. There's an international conference of exorcists in Rome every
Correct.
2 years. What's that like? What do you guys do?
I'm sorry?
What do you do there? Do you just talk about your cases? Do you?
Oh, no. No, they usually bring in experts from all kinds of fields. In the course of the week, we have conferences and discussions, but generally there are speakers that are come there from literally all over the world, and we'll speak different issues. There's a Dr. Richard Gallagher. You might want to look him up sometime. He's a psychiatrist out of New York City, but he has several books out actually. But he's very, very famous in working with this very issue of being able to determine from a psychiatric point of view, a person who is actually demonically possessed. He has some rather interesting things to say about it. So in fact, he has actually referred some cases to me in this area here. So yeah, he's actually supposed to be a speaker at our next meeting, which is supposed to be next September. So yeah, we probe these things because see, every case is unique. And they don't fall into a pattern where exactly the same symptomology or the same things happen. Every case is unique, and they have to be investigated in order to determine what the approach is going to be in that case.
Okay, that kind of brings me to, in your dissertation, you had said something about they're increasing the needs for this. Is that nationwide, worldwide? Do you have any numbers that you could give?
No, I don't have numbers off the top of my head, but yes, it's definitely increasing worldwide. Part of it is because people are playing with the occult. So for example, I was at Millersville University last week and I spoke to a group there, and one of the girls said to me, she said, my roommates are into tarot cards and crystals. And she said, what should I do on a case like that? And I said to her, find new roommates because you're in trouble. People are into the occult. They're playing games and they don't realize how serious the dangers are. Again, I'll give you an example. I had a phone call from a priest one day, and he said to me, I have a young man who called me who's scared to death. Doesn't know what to do. He said, what happened was some friends of his said, there's this house we know that's supposed to be haunted. And we want to go over to this house and use a Ouija board and see whether or not anything happens. And the guy said to them, well, okay, if you get me drunk first, I'll go. And so they did, and he went. And of course, all kinds of things happened. The Ouija board worked, but the spirit that they were talking with said, don't worry, everything stays here. Nothing will, follow you home or anything like that. Of course, demons are also liars, and you have to be careful. So he went home, and sure enough, it followed him home. And now this young man was under attack, physically under attack, and didn't know what to do. So he called his priest, asked his priest what to do. The priest called me and said, what do I do? In this case, he was a Catholic. I said, you go to confession. He did something really stupid and don't do it again. So, but yeah, there's a lot more people that are into the occult or into all kinds of witchcraft, Ouija boards, tarot cards, seances. I had a call yesterday from a young man from Reading who told me he's a psychic, and I just, I said, you're in real serious. And now he said, I'm tapping into some really dark and dangerous things. I said, yes, you're skating on very thin ice. Because you're now playing with the occult, you're playing with the dark forces, and they're taking advantage of it. So yeah, it's real. It does happen.
There was a part in your dissertation where you said some Christian sects believe that if you're saved, that the demons can't harm you. So that's not true of Catholicism, that even if you are faithful, you can still be attacked. That's correct.
I interviewed individuals for my dissertation, and 2 cases of, they were chaplains at universities, evangelical universities, and they both told me that they felt that, genuinely, if a person has genuinely accepted Christ as their Lord and Savior, they cannot be possessed. So they rule that out right off the bat. So these young people come to them for help, and they'll say, well, you've got a mental health problem, you can't be possessed. That or your conversion wasn't really genuine anyway. So they just dismiss it. But it's an amazing thing because I get a lot of calls from people who are not Catholic, and they will go to their own ministers and they will ask for help, and the ministers can't do anything for them, and they say, well, go to the Catholics because they deal with that stuff. So that's how I get a lot of cases that really do come to me because the Protestant ministers have actually recommended them to me.
There was another question that said, have you ever felt any spirit or entity latch onto you?
Latch on to me, I would say no. Attack, yes. Happen. You have to be very, very careful because, again, as I said, that the spiritual world, the demonic world is real and it's all around us. And so sometimes if you're not very, very careful, or sometimes, when you're dealing with, let's say a demon knows that you're going to be coming up against a really important case, well, they're going to kind of make you, get you off the track, so to speak. They're going to try to attack you or get you discouraged, or they come after you afterwards when you've been successful at freeing somebody. They're angry that you have managed to free them, and so they'll come after you and attack you. So it's a matter of, they can physically attack people. I've had many people who will call me, they will wake up and they'll see a handprint, a red handprint on their body, or scratches on their bodies in places that they can't reach. So yes, demons will sometimes physically attack individuals. I've had, but nothing major, nothing that I couldn't handle with the help of God.
I did see that you made a differentiation between attack and possession in your paper. That's when I was kind of scrolling through. Can you talk more about that?
Yes, that's great, because there are actually 4 different ways or levels, if you want to call it, of demonic attack. All right. The first one is the one that we're all involved in, and that is temptation. We're all tempted to do things that are wrong, and everybody's part of that. You don't get away from that at all. The second thing is I referred to it a moment ago, is what we call an infestation, where a place, a house, someplace can be what we would call haunted. And ghosts are real, all right? And so sometimes these ghosts are, it may be what we would call lost souls who have not been able to find their way to heaven, all right, for different reasons. Or maybe demons who are pretending to be lost souls, right? So these are infestations of places, all right? So you can do what we would call a minor exorcism in order to free a place like that. Then there are what we would call oppression, where a person is attacked, like I was just talking about. I've heard many cases of those where people are physically attacked. Then there's actually obsession, where a person is overwhelmed by thoughts, demonic thoughts. Demons cannot read your thoughts, but they can suggest things to you, right? And so they can drive you crazy sometimes if you really pay attention to them. You have to be careful about that. And then finally, there is actual possession, where a demon will actually enter into and take control of a certain person's body. That is relatively rare. All right, but it does happen, and it seems to be happening a bit more frequently today than it used to in the past. But there's also such a thing as, believe it or not, what we call perfect possession. And this one's really frightening. It's where a person intentionally and consciously gives themselves to Satan and allows Satan to take complete control of their life. And the interesting thing about a case like that would be, you would never know it, because they don't show these signs of manifestations of those sorts of demonic things that we're used to seeing. They're perfectly normal, but they have already given themselves completely over to the satanic, all right? And they tend to be people who are in positions of power, because that's what it's ultimately all about. It's about power. So, policemen or judges or lawyers or, all kinds of, politicians, all kinds of things. People will actually give themselves to the devil concretely, intentionally, in order to gain some sort of power. And so then you would never know that they were actually possessed. But it does happen as well. And unfortunately, I do have one particular case right now that I'm dealing with. But these are different ways or different levels of demonic influence or demonic attack.
So it can be, I guess when I think of possession, I think of like one of the other demons, but it can be Satan himself that possesses.
Yeah, well, of course, it can be any number, and one person could be possessed by more than one demon. I had a case that I assisted at in Tulsa, Oklahoma on several occasions, of a woman who, as a child, had been the victim of a satanic ritual abuse. And she was also now she suffered from dissociative identity disorder. She had multiple altars, all of which had multiple demons in possession of them. So it's a very, very frightening sort of thing that can happen. And again, we have to remember that demons don't have personalities like we do. They don't have a personal name. But sometimes if you say, okay, what is your name? And they'll give you a name, but it tends to be, let's say, a demon, an idol from ancient times, that from Bible or ancient Near East or something like that, a demon of, idolatry, let's say, sexual fertility, whatever. When they tell you their name, it gives you a clue as to what caused the possession in the first place. See, in other words, demons don't just pick on somebody and say, oh, I think I'll possess this person today. They always have to have some legal right to be there. And that means the person themselves did something that gave them the right to come in, that gave them the right to attack. An interesting thing, I've talked a number of times about this. You ever heard of a speak box? Guys there in the class ever heard of speak boxes? Yes, okay.
Nod.
Yeah. Put your hands up if you heard of a speak box, if you know what they are.
Is anyone, can you guys put your hands up? I don't know how to. This is
Yeah, okay. Let me talk about speak boxes for a moment.
I'm gonna turn it one way.
The ones they use on BuzzFeed themselves.
The little like static
Yeah,
things,
the
and then
static
it's
is
like,
the radio.
you just have like. And
You
then
guys
it's
not
like,
watch BuzzFeed themselves?
No.
I don't like the narrators.
Some show, I guess they've seen it on.
I love
Speak-
Sorry, now I can't get it off Trey. I don't know how to. You guys mess with it.
Try your water. I think I should.
So yeah, I guess a handful of them have heard of that.
Yeah, speak boxes are devices. They're something like a cell phone, only they're supposed to be wired in such a way that a person can speak with the dead. I had 3 different cases of these where an individual, one particular case, a woman had a younger brother that she took care of. He died, and she was really distraught. As a lot of times it happens, people say, is he okay? Is he in a good place? And a friend of hers told her, well, don't worry, get a speak box and you can talk to him and see if he's okay. At one point, I actually went on Amazon.com. You could actually buy them on Amazon.com. I don't think you can now, but you did. But anyway, so she got one of these, and sure enough, she was speaking with an entity. You don't have to call somebody. It's like somebody described it as white noise. You pick up this background, and all of a sudden you're talking to this person. And so she was talking to this individual, said it was her brother, and he was fine, and he was really grateful for what she did for him, and so forth. But then after that point, she started being under attack. Big time attack, and she couldn't understand why. And I said to her, well, what you did was you basically opened the door to hell, because it wasn't your brother. That was a demon who was pretending to be your brother. But you made a connection, and now he's going to take advantage of it. Another example, right out of York itself, I had a case down there of a man who was hearing the voice of a woman in his house, and he couldn't understand what she was saying or where she was coming from, but there was this voice. And I was at the house a number of times. And we couldn't figure out exactly what was going on. So one day I was at the door leaving, and I said to him, I heard the voice myself. And I said, and now all we have to do is determine, is this a demon or is this a lost soul? And when we figure out which it is, we'll know how to approach the situation. So I said, fine, I left. But what he did was he called in a paranormal investigating team, and they set up their cameras and their video equipment and so forth. And literally all hell broke loose in that house. And he called me and he couldn't understand what was going on. I said, what do you mean? You issued an open invitation. Come on in, demons, we want to hear you. We want to see you. We want to record you. And he couldn't figure out why things were going so haywire in his house. And then I had to go in and clean up the mess. Of course, that's the way it works. But we have to see people today are dabbling in things that they don't understand, and they're getting themselves into a lot of trouble by doing it. And they're opening the doors to this other reality, this other dimension, which is real. And they don't really take it seriously enough and stay away from it. But yeah, those things happen.
Is it frowned on to try to communicate with the dead in general? Like if my mom is deceased, if I tried to contact her, I could be opening the portal.
Yes, you don't want to do that. See, God doesn't really allow that. Doesn't really allow that kind of communication with the dead. So whether it be seances or mediums or any of that other kind of stuff, that's all supernatural stuff that you really want to stay away from. Because again, you can't control, and humans will take advantage of that.
Is that because it's just supposed to be, I mean, they're in heaven and we just take that, I mean, we don't need to communicate with them? Is that?
Well, see, again, as a Catholic, we believe in purgatory, that, souls, after they die, they don't necessarily either go to heaven or hell. Sometimes we need to go to a place where we need to be perfected first. And that's what happens sometimes. Some of these ghost stories are actually souls in purgatory that are asking for prayer, asking for help, but they don't communicate. They don't have conversations. They don't do all kinds of other things in those sorts of ways. So yeah, we don't communicate with the dead. We can pray for the dead, but we don't communicate with them. They're not permitted to communicate with us.
Okay. I guess you could understand people's wanting to do that, but still don't.
Yeah, but they don't realize, again, that the dangers that are involved.
Gotcha. Okay. There was a question about physical signs, maybe skin being discolored, emaciated. Is there any physical signs that someone is possessed?
In terms of how would you see, it's an interesting thing. Let me step back even from the psychological point of view. A person comes to me and they're telling me they have these issues, these problems, these difficulties. One of the first thing we always do, and I think you had actually mentioned this in one of your emails to me, is how do we handle a case when a person comes to me, or their parents or whatever bring them to me? The first thing we do is we do an intake. This is like when you go to the doctor for the first time. I have a 7-page intake form where we actually go through and ask a history of the individual. And we look at, mental illness or those other sorts of things to see if anything is part of that. Or we also look at the other side. Have you been involved in the occult or in any of those sorts of things? So we put that all together and we kind of approach the situation. When I meet the individual, one of the first things I'll say to them is, have you ever been under therapy or any mental health issues or so forth? If they say yes, then I'll say, are you on medication? And they'll say yes. And I'll say, does it help? And they'll say yes. That gives me a hint that it's probably a mental health issue at core. If a person is taking the medication, but it's not helping, and they've been on all different medications and nothing works, that tells me that maybe it's a spiritual problem at core, right? But we always require a mental health evaluation, psychologist, psychiatrist, therapist, evaluation of the person before we proceed. And I can tell you that I've been in touch with many mental health professionals on a dual consultation process, where we have a person who claims to be possessed. I'll be talking to their doctor. We go back and forth in terms of, what is the real issue here? What's the real cause of the problem here? Because as I said, sometimes it's both. It's not just one or the other. And so the doctor or whomever will handle the psychological issue, and then I will try to deal with the spiritual issue, but we work in tandem. So that's what we do. We have to investigate the case and make sure they have an evaluation, and then we proceed based upon the evaluation of the mental health professionals. We assume that there is a mental health issue at core, all right? But then when we investigate it, we can see that there may be more than just that.
So you could treat in conjunction, they could still be treated for their mental health and then.
Exactly, yes, yes.
Does that make, I don't know how to say this, old school Catholics angry at you? Because you seem to be bridging this gap between mental health and spirituality. And I would think some traditionalists would be like, not happy about that, because you're kind of a little bit ahead of your time with trying to, I would assume some Catholics wouldn't believe in mental health at all, maybe.
No, I don't think so. I think that Catholics in general, I think, are very open to that supernatural dimension. They're probably more open to the demonic and to demonic influence than probably a lot of Protestants tend to be.
Oh, absolutely, but not the mental health component is what I'm saying.
Yeah, but yeah, so no, I think but they know there's another dimension. and they know that there could be a mental health issue at cause. So I don't run into that problem. What you just described, it's the opposite, really.
Because, you know, in your lit review, you acknowledge that there's not a lot of data, there's not a lot of research. So it seems like you are just now starting that the church has not in the past been super concerned with ruling out mental illness.
Well, it depends, because again, the cases tended to be more rare than they are today, all right? And it was interesting too, when I was doing proposals for my research for both my master's and for my dissertation, you know, I was running into all kinds of hesitation, let's say, on the part of, you know, the professors. And it was not because they didn't think my topic was relevant. They were afraid that it wouldn't be acceptable. That it wouldn't pass in terms of, you know, muster in terms of the academic community. You know, I was finally able to find someone who was really, and actually, one of my professors, who was a psychologist, and who herself, and I described some of these dynamics in the dissertation, who herself, in the course of her own therapy work, managed to encounter some of these demonic things that happens. And for example, she told me that one time, a friend of hers came, she was preparing to get married, a young woman, and the young woman said, oh, she was interested in past life experiences, and the therapist was actually a licensed hypnotist and wanted her to put her under hypnosis so that she could see if there were any past life things that would be beneficial to her. And so the woman agreed, and she put the young lady under hypnosis. And when she did, she said all of a sudden her whole demeanor changed, her face changed, her voice changed, and there was this deep guttural voice that came out and said, you know, who are you and what do you want with me? And she knew that she was dealing with a demon. She wasn't dealing with the young woman anymore. And she said she brought her out very quickly because she had tapped into something that just was not, you know, right, supernatural. So yeah, it's and I managed to find her, and she took over as my mentor in terms of my dissertation because she knew what I was researching because she had experienced it herself in her own practice.
Is that Miller or Bomberger or one of those? No,
Yes.
Bomberger. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'd never read a dissertation before. Pretty long. A lot of work went into that.
Yes, it was. Although it's interesting because relatively speaking, mine was fairly short.
Okay. So they're usually long, in excess of 144 pages.
They can be, yeah, they can be much longer. Yeah.
Gosh. Okay. For anyone in here thinking about pursuing their degree. Oh, we have a question. Roger, you have a question?
Yeah, do we ask questions at the end, or?
You can ask a question now.
I was wondering, when I used to go.
Can you hear Roger?
I don't know if you can hear me.
Come over
Not
here.
really, but repeat either or repeat the question.
This is Roger. He's a psych major. He actually stayed over from my first class because he wanted to be here. So.
Okay, sure. Hello.
So I have a question because when I used to go at my Catholic school, they referred to sleep paralysis as to be by demons as well. I just wonder if that is actually us, like our imagination, or is it us seeing the actual world of the.
You said sleep paralysis?
Yeah, sleep paralysis. They really.
Now, sleep paralysis is a purely biological function.
Okay.
It's not supernatural in any way. I know it can scare the daylights out of you when it happens. I had it happen to me several times years ago. I know what it is, but it's a pure biological function, and it really doesn't have any supernatural meaning. There's a totally different experience that a person would have in terms of a demonic attack. And I had people with that, but see, sleep paralysis is something that happens when you're kind of like in a half awake, half asleep state. Maybe we're just not. Whereas the thing that would occur for a demon, with a demon on you, is doesn't occur in that half in between state. It's something different. So if people are thinking they're seeing things in that sleep paralysis state, that's probably just their imagination.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Good question.
Okay, I'm looking through my other questions here. I saw that in an interview you had done, I think it was ABC 27, that you we mentioned holy water. Are there other like tools or items that you would bring along, or is that just to rule out, or?
No, no, actually, there are, we do Catholics use two main things that we, first is the holy water, as you mentioned, and the other one is blessed oil. See, the oil and the water are not just used as such. First of all, if I'm going to bless holy water, for example, the first thing I do is I have salt, and I do an exorcism of salt. And then I do the blessing of the salt. And then I do an exorcism of the water. And then I do a blessing of the water. And then there's a special prayer in which the salt and water are mixed together and blessed together, right? And that's the water that's used for holy water, traditionally speaking. If any of you, and I just watched this again recently for different reasons, but the original Hocus Pocus movie, remember that? Remember they actually talked in there where the which is said about using salt. They would be away from, couldn't cross the circle that was made by salt. Anybody who's ever seen the original or read the original book of Dracula, all right? And in that movie, they actually used circle salt and the Blessed Sacrament as protection against the demons, against the vampires. So there's something in the salt. The salt itself is kind of a sacred substance. And it's interesting when you use the holy water that has salt in it, when the water evaporates, the salt remains, so it has a longer protection time. You know, I had a case of a woman who I blessed one day with this salt, the holy water with the salt in it, and she jumped and she said, "Wait a minute, that was stinging. What was that?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I've been blessed with holy water lots of times, but that one was different. What was different about it?" She was feeling the salt that was in the water that she had never felt before. Right? So yeah, we use salt and we use oil. Sometimes during a case, so not all cases are exorcisms. There may be prayers of deliverance, in which case I will sometimes anoint the person with this sacred oil that's been exorcised and blessed. Anoint their senses, anoint their head, so forth, and that can be strong protection as well. So those are the two main things we use in terms of actual physical contact, is the oil and the salt.
You wouldn't recommend us watching Hocus Pocus though, right? Doesn't that kind of fall under like the no Hocus Pocus, the movie?
You remember that? Yeah, the original one.
Isn't that okay to watch though? We shouldn't watch it?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that per se.
Oh, but what about Harry Potter?
That's an interesting question. There are a lot of people, let's say there's a lot of debate about Harry Potter, right? Some think that, and it's the same way, I'm gonna give you another example, is yoga, right? There are some in the exorcist community that say yoga is completely wrong, completely demonic. Others say, oh, it's perfectly okay if you're just using it for exercise. So Harry Potter, there's a debate among exorcists as to whether or not it's okay or not. Interestingly enough, I tend to fall on both sides. In terms of Harry Potter, I don't think there's anything wrong with Harry Potter. I've read all the books and I've seen all the movies, and I just think it's a story of good versus evil, and I don't have a problem with Harry Potter. But yoga, I do have a problem with, because yoga in itself is, every posture in yoga is actually a act of worship of some Hindu deity. And so you have to be careful about opening portals there, even again, when you don't intend to. So yoga, I would personally say no. Harry Potter, I don't think there's too much of a problem. It all depends on what you do with it too, of course.
True, if you're like worshiping it and idolizing it.
Yeah, exactly, sure.
That could be an issue. Sure. Okay. So with the numbers, are you pretty busy? I know you get a lot of calls. You've been to Tulsa, Oklahoma. I don't know how many the diocese has of you. Are you called far away often?
Well, first of all, every diocese is supposed to have an official exorcist. Every diocese does, right? Technically speaking, I'm only authorized within my own diocese, but sometimes it will happen that other dioceses, I will get calls from other dioceses and I will go there, but only with the permission of that bishop. So even, for example, when I went out to the west, to Tulsa and other places, I usually had to have a letter of permission, both from my bishop and from that bishop to assist in those cases. So yeah, but I get calls constantly from everywhere. One day, I had a call. Actually, I got a message from the diocese that there was a man who was trying to reach me from Indonesia. And I said, Indonesia? And I said, I don't think I'm going to follow through on that one. The next day, the doorbell rang and I answered the door and there was this Oriental man and woman standing at the door. And it was this man from Indonesia. And it turned out that they had a son who was a student at Penn State and they were here for his graduation. But they were having problems back home, and one of their relatives had seen that same ABC 27 News interview in Indonesia, and she said, well, you're going to be near him. Why don't you go look him up and talk to him about this situation? So they did. They came to see me, and it was interesting because the man, they were Chinese, but from Indonesia. The man was a historian. He traveled all over the world. He talked about going to Germany and able to purchase one of the old German World War I helmets, the ones with the big spikes on the top and so forth. And he was really proud of this, brought it home. But then they started having all kinds of problems in their home. And he went through all kinds of details of it. And then all of a sudden they started seeing this soldier standing in the corner of the room wearing that same helmet. And so they knew that there was something wrong here. It was probably cursed. And that's what they were coming to me to ask me for help with. And so I was able to do some things for them here. While they were here, they came to see me twice. The second time, they told me that things had been taken care of. So yeah, there are such things as curses too, by the way. They really are real. They do happen. And so people can curse you. Objects can be cursed. I had a case of a young woman who purchased a ceramic doll on eBay. And as soon as she got it, she knew that there was a problem, something wasn't right. And she started hearing these voices. Again, we talked about the voices. A young man and an older woman, both of whom they claimed that they had committed suicide, and they were talking to her about the other world and so on and so forth, and telling her that she should commit suicide too. And that's one of the things that they want to do. They want you to commit suicide. They want you to give up and give in. And again, I insisted that she had to see a doctor. She had to see a therapist. She was on medication. She hated the medication because she said it made her feel like a zombie. She did send the doll back, but she had already opened that door, so to speak. We tried everything we could to get her to close the door, but she did, in fact, end up committing suicide. It overwhelmed her. I got a very sad email from her mother telling me what had happened, and it was very sad. She just couldn't handle it anymore. It was too much for her, and she killed herself. So it's very sad, but that's exactly what demons want you to do. They want you to give up. Demons cannot kill you, by the way, right? Sometimes you have little children and a spirit will appear to them and say, you have to do such and such, or we're going to hurt your family, we're going to hurt your mommy and daddy. And they get these little kids to try to do all kinds of things. When in fact, demons cannot actually kill you. That's not within their power. They may say they can, but they can't. They're liars. You have to be very careful.
That sounds very much like my patient. That's why I was surprised. She said she got it from a doll, and she didn't say send it back to me. She said that she sold it, which I remember thinking was funny at the time. I'm like, well, if you knew it was possessed, like, why would you sell it? I'm just trying to follow your thought process. And that was about 2020, and I have not seen her since. So it could potentially be the same one.
I don't think so, because I don't think that particular person that I was talking about was it was committed.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, it is very sad.
Yeah. So dolls. So should we be careful when you're buying things? Like, what if
Yes.
you're antiquing and you like something and then you're like, shoot, like there's some vibe about it or something. Not vibe.
Especially when you're talking about things like eBay and places like that, you have to be very, very careful of what it is that you're getting, what it is that you want it for, what does it look like, what is it, its purpose, you have to be careful about all of those things.
because a doll is pretty benign. Like you're not using necessarily a doll for the occult. You know, I could see Ouija board on eBay, but a doll. A student just asked, like, how do you know if it's possessed? Like, you get it home and you're like,
Actually, you don't. But again, I think if you in my dissertation, I said that even for therapists, one of the things that they have to do is sensitivity, a certain, in a certain sense, trust your gut, right? You have to, if you're feeling uncomfortable about a certain thing, then get rid of it, right? Don't hold on to it, don't play with it, because you have to trust that sense that you're having that something isn't quite right with this particular object.
but you probably want to like destroy it, right? Because then if you're donating it, someone else is gonna
Exactly.
you're just gonna put it on
Yes.
someone else. And okay.
Yes.
I like the Annabelle series.
They're mentioning the Annabelle series. Are you familiar? There's a doll, I believe. Is it like a
Yes,
couple?
yes.
It's in the Conjuring too.
Yeah.
Oh, The Conjuring.
Yeah.
Yes. There's a couple movies that have the same. Do you watch those movies?
No, I haven't seen any of those. Although the only one I would say is that the interesting thing is that many of those are based on actual cases.
Yeah.
The Conjuring is, and there's a couple of the Possession of Emily Rose, and also The Exorcist itself, the original movie, The Exorcist. Those were all based on actual cases, real cases. So it was interesting. William Friedkin, I think, who did the original movie, The Exorcist, went to see Father Gabriel Amora, who was the chief exorcist for Rome for many years, and died recently. And he went to see him, and he first of all asked him what he thought about that movie. And Father Amora said that he thought it was pretty good, actually, it was accurate. He thought some of the special effects were a little over the top, but on the whole, he thought the movie was pretty accurate. So Friedkin asked if he could actually witness an actual exorcism, and could he film it? And Father Amora said yes. And Friedkin ultimately said that what he experienced for real was much worse than anything that he could put into his movie. Right? So yeah, it can be very, very frightening sometimes. It can be very unnerving.
Do exorcists have to follow HIPAA?
Oh, someone just asked if exorcists have to follow HIPAA, or is there some other ethical guideline for?
Well, in terms of following HIPAA, that depends, as a psychologist, I would be required to. But in terms of, just a priest, I certainly think certain ethics of secrecy and confidentiality would apply. But there's no standard rule that we would apply with regard to HIPAA.
Because I often use the priest confession example when talking about HIPAA, that I have to break confidentiality in therapy if someone tells me they're going to hurt somebody. But as far as I know, confidentiality, if someone comes to confession and tells you they're going to hurt someone, you do not break confidentiality for that.
You can't, right, exactly. That's a very good point. It depends on the setting within which the person is telling you these things. So yeah, you have to be very careful. There's a thin line, so to speak, between what you can and cannot say. But it doesn't usually happen. A person doesn't, if a person is possessed, they don't usually come to me and say, well, I'm going to hurt such and such. It doesn't really happen that way. They come to you fairly normal. Some of the symptomology that persons go through when they are possessed, sometimes they actually black out. They have a span of amnesia, space where they really cannot remember anything that they've done or said, which is what ties it together with something like DID. So usually what will happen is during the course of the actual formal exorcism, that may be when the physical violence may occur. I remember one particular case, the very, very first case that I ever had of a real exorcism many years ago. And I've been an exorcist for 11 years now. But many years ago, it was a young Hispanic girl, and I was at her home. And she was at one end of the table, I was at the other end. Her mother was on one side and her brother was on the other side. And I was just interviewing her, just talking to her, finding out her history. And all of a sudden, her eyes rolled up into her head. And she just looked at me, and this deep guttural voice came out and said, "Get out of my house." And she leapt across the table at me. Thank God her brother was there, had a football player's build. He leaped across the table and grabbed her. The table went flying, everything went flying in all different directions. He held her down. And that can happen sometimes, that there can be some actual physical attacks that will occur under demonic influence. And a person may not even be aware that it's happening. They don't even realize it.
might look kind of similar to psychosis, but
Yeah.
okay. Thinking about something else. What were we talking about? Oh, yeah, another question. I'm sorry.
He asked if he's familiar with Amityville Horror, because I know that's a big debate against possession or mental health.
They want to know if you're familiar with Amityville Horror and if there's a big debate between mental health and possession with, that's a movie, right?
Yeah, but it's like
Okay.
a real story.
And I remember seeing it a long time ago. And again, I think the important thing to keep in mind is this: it's never an either or situation. It's always going to be both. But the matter is, which is the cause, which is the effect, right? So there may be a mental health basis for something, but there's going to be a spiritual dimension, because a human person is of all three levels, right? The physical, the mental, and the spiritual. And so it can be both at the same time. But which is the dominant cause? Which is the root of the problem, of the issue? And that's what's really important.
But did you have a theory about that particular?
I don't remember the details. I really can't say. I don't remember the story itself. I just remember, a long time ago seeing that particular movie, but I don't remember the details.
The thing that I when I saw The Exorcist, the thing that I didn't think was super accurate about it is the slang they used. Because I wouldn't think a demon would use modern slang. Like they use some words that I assume demons are eternal and several hundred years old, but I guess they mimic what.
Okay, first of all, demons are older than the human race.
Okay.
Okay, they've been around since the very beginning. All right, they've been around before we were around. So, and as I oftentimes tell people, demons don't get tired. They don't take vacations. They don't stop for potty break. They're there all the time, constantly. And so they know us better than we know ourselves. And even though they can't read our thoughts, they can read us. All right, they can read our postures. They can read our attitudes. They can read the tone of our voice. They can pretty much, surmise what's going on inside of us, even though they can't read your thoughts. And so, I think it's important that we realize that demons, they play games with us. And there's another interesting thing. The first question is, why do demons possess people, right? And the truth is, we don't have an answer to that question. Now, we know that they can only do what God allows them to do, nothing more. But again, it goes back to, as I said, we have to open the door. We have to give the portal, allow them to come in. But why it even occurs at all, we really don't have an answer to that, right? But we do know that what demons are trying to do is bring as many people down with them as they possibly can. And usually it's an interesting kind of thing, though, very, very frequently, as it was actually in the movie The Exorcist and the book The Exorcist, it was not the girl who was possessed that was the target of the demon. It was the priest, right? So oftentimes they're going after somebody else. They're not actually going after the person who's possessed. Because when a person's possessed, in other words, the demon takes over, but they cannot force them to do something contrary to their will. In other words, they don't take over their will. And so demons can control and manipulate their bodies, but they can't force a person to choose to do something that they don't want to do. For example, kill themselves. A person has to choose to do that. They can't, a demon can't make them do it. And so it's an interesting kind of thing. It's this whole relationship. Why do demons even possess people? We don't know, but we do know that people are more and more opening the doors to it, and it's happening more and more frequently.
Well, that makes sense, because in the movie The Exorcist, it's a little girl, and if you're going to possess someone, a little girl is not going to get you much power or influence. So, yeah, that makes sense.
But she opened the door by playing with the Ouija board.
And they needed an old priest and a young priest. I remember they said that.
It was the young priest. The young priest.
The out priest?
The young priest was the one that they were after, that she was after.
The young priest. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I remember them saying something like that. They knew. Yeah. Okay. Oh. Is it ever that there are two priests at an exorcist?
Oh, sure. Yeah, actually, a priest would never go in alone. That's a very dangerous thing. We have to be very, very careful because there are certain lines that we should not cross. And I do have another priest who assists me. He's an exorcist actually for another diocese, and we usually help each other. So if he has cases, I'll assist him, or if I have a case, he assists me. But we kind of keep an eye on each other so that we don't say or do things. Sometimes you can be tempted to ask a question of the demon just out of pure curiosity, and that's very, very dangerous because then you're playing into their hands. There are certain things that you can ask the demon, like, for example, how many of you are there? What is your name? And what gave you the legal right to be here? Okay? And that's an interesting thing. Now, here's a case where a person can be possessed because of somebody else. So, for example, that case I was talking about, that young Hispanic girl, when we did the actual exorcism and we asked the demons, what gave you the legal right to be here? Her answer was, he promised her to us at her birth. In other words, her father, who was this was a case, the father was Cuban, the mother was Puerto Rican. The father was a practitioner of Santeria, which is a cult sort of practice, a cult practice. And he did not want this child. He disowned her at her birth, and he literally gave her to the demons at her birth. And so now she's possessed because her father had legal authority over her, and he could do what he wanted with her under that spiritual authority. She was possessed by 3 demons. It was very easy to free her the first time because it wasn't her fault that she was possessed. It was her father's fault. But then she didn't make any changes in her life, and she went on doing all kinds of things that were not nice, and she became repossessed. Only now, the second time, it's her fault. She's the one who opened the door, and it was much, much more difficult to free her the second time than it was the first time. So, but yeah, demons can only do what they're allowed to do. They have to have legal rights. So I can only ask demons certain questions. I remember one case where I asked a question that I shouldn't have asked, and the other priest was there, and he said, "Oh, well, you can't go there." And I said, "Oh yeah, you're right. Back up, stop." So fortunately, there was a check and balance. I also have a whole team that assists me. There are 2 doctors, a lawyer. There's a whole team of professional people that assist. So I have 2 guys that I call my muscle men. They're just there for physical protection, literally. So yeah, we never do it alone because it's very dangerous on many different levels.
I was wondering about the liability in a lawyer. That seems like a smart idea, so that because people are litigious nowadays and might sue for whatever reason if someone's harmed during the.
Exactly. And actually, we do have a release form. If a person is going to go through a formal exorcism, they have to sign a release form before it's actually done. So yeah, we cover ourselves that way as well.
Okay. Did anyone else have questions? No other questions? Oh, yeah.
I was just wondering, I know that you mentioned that there are some people that do it out of their own, fruition to actually.
Do you want to come up here and ask it since it's a long one? She's going to come up and ask at the microphone. I was going to repeat it, but this is a little longer.
Sorry, I know you mentioned that there are some people that try to become possessed, and I was just wondering how you would go about actually exorcising them or being able to help them, because that seems like something that would be a very, very difficult task to do.
You're exactly right. And what happens is if a person intentionally gave themselves over to Satan, then something would have happened that would have caused a conversion on their part. Wanting to get out of it now, okay? And so what has to happen is there has to be a whole renunciation of everything that they were involved in. Another example of something that people don't realize is the Masons. The Masonic orders are all of a demonic origin, right? And people who are in the Masons, the lower levels of Masons, most people don't realize they're just, a social service organization. But in fact, the higher you go, in the hierarchy of the Masons, the more you become aware of what the real purpose behind them is. And so we have a whole ritual for a person who wants to leave the Masons, and I've had that happen, they have to go through a whole ritual of renunciation, renouncing all of their Masonic ties. We've had cases, I had one recently of a man who inherited a sword that they thought was a Civil War sword, they discovered later on was actually a Masonic sword. And he was going to give it to his son, but then realized what it was. We had to go and we had to exorcise the sword. It has to be destroyed. So yeah, you have to renounce those things. And I would say you're right. If a person actually was fully possessed and then wanted to get out of it, it would be a very, very difficult situation because they would have to renounce it. And I don't think the demons would be very happy about that at all.
Speaking of the Masons, I made a Dan Brown reference the other day, and these kids are so young; they're not familiar. So
That's right there. Yeah.
yeah, I forgot it. They're saying who of the Da Vinci Code, because that was quite the stir there for a while, like 2003, I think that there was an uproar, right, in the Catholic Church. No.
You know, there's a lot of stuff going on. I had a case not too long ago of a family. Their son, a grown man, died, and I say that intentionally because at the time they didn't know if it was suicide, drug overdose, or homicide. They were still doing an autopsy to determine the actual cause of death. So the family went to his home to clean the house out and so forth, and discovered there was an entire room in his house that he called his spiritual room. And this room, when we walked into it, it was unbelievable. From floor to ceiling, wall to wall, nothing but occult practice items. There were crystal balls, tarot cards, Ouija boards, you name it, you know, statues. It was unbelievable what was in that place, in that room. And they're very, very difficult. And so what we had to do, first of all, I did an exorcism of the room. And then eventually what we did was I got gloves for these people, and they blessed the gloves. All of the stuff had to be taken, burned or destroyed. And once it was burned or destroyed, all the ashes had to be gathered together so that could be buried someplace in sacred ground. Interestingly enough, they said even after it was all burnt or broken and destroyed, it still filled 4 50-gallon drums. That's how much stuff was in that room. Right? So there was a man who was deep into the occult. And again, I don't know what the final result was in terms of his death, but it was definitely a very, very bad situation.
I mean, what does someone need that many Ouija boards for? That seems excessive. That seems like a hoarding situation almost. That's wow.
But I think, it comes down to, what I really think personally is that there's 2 things that are going on. First of all, as a whole, in the secular world in which we live, not just in the United States, but worldwide, there is this increasing loss of faith. People don't believe in God anymore, all right? But we also live in a world that is highly insecure, and people are frightened, all right? And they're looking for some sense of security in some way, shape, or form. They're looking for answers, black or white. They want some sense of security. And so they turn to, if they don't have faith in God, then they're going to turn to something else as a means of giving this sense of certainty in their lives, whether it be horoscopes or whether it be Ouija boards or tarot cards or mediums or whatever it might happen to be. They'll turn to something where they can get a black and white answer to give them a sense of security. And that's why so many people are turning to that kind of stuff today, and not without realizing the fact that they're getting into deep trouble when they do so.
That kind of reminds me of something I brought up the other day in class, and some of the newer, more progressive Catholics were arguing with me. But Santa Claus, that's a no-no, right?
Santa Claus?
Idolatry, kind of.
No, Santa Claus is based on Saint Nicholas.
Okay.
I mean, there actually was a Saint Nicholas, all right? And the whole story of Saint Nicholas was the fact that as Bishop of Myra, there was a family very poor. They had three daughters, and they had no money for a dowry for them to be married, and their father was going to sell them all into prostitution. And instead, Nicholas heard about it, and he came and 3 times tossed a bag of gold through a window secretly in order to give them a dowry so that they could be married. And this is the whole point of Saint Nicholas. And Santa Claus is the Dutch St. Nicholas, and that Santa Claus came to America with the Dutch settlers as Santa Claus. So Santa Claus is actually based on St. Nicholas, the Bishop of Myra. And the beauty of Santa Claus is the beauty of anonymous the beauty in the faces of parents who give gifts to their children anonymously, all right? Just as Nicholas did to those 3 girls and saved their lives. So no, there's nothing wrong. I know there are some people who are, they go too far in the other direction, let's put it that way. They go too far to the right extreme. And they think that, oh, Santa Claus, you can't believe in Santa Claus. It's no. Yes, you can. We have lots of those kinds of things that are basically evolutions of fundamental Christian practices. There's nothing wrong with it.
Okay, but not Easter Bunny.
Not the Easter Bunny. Well, not the Easter Bunny. No. If you go back into Greek mythology, you'll see where the connection comes with the Easter Bunny, but we won't go into that.
Okay, that one seems a little far-fetched. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Is there any music that could possibly like invite demons in?
They want to know about music that could possibly invite demons in. Anything they need to stay away from?
Well, that's a very good point. I think a lot of it has to do with emotions. In other words, what does the music evoke within you? What kind of response does it evoke? They used to say, for example, heavy metal was the music of anger. So it really depends on the type of music one is listening to, and what kind of response in the individual it's evoking. Music per se is not a problem, but again, what the music, there's some, actually, I don't spend a lot of time listening to that, but sometimes people will share lyrics of certain songs with me, and I go, wait a minute, you got to be kidding, do people really listen to these for the lyrics? Are they really reading the lyrics? Do they know what it is these songs are actually saying? So yeah, I would say you have to be careful in terms of what the song is saying, in terms of the lyrics, but also in terms of the emotion that it evokes, that awakens within a person.
Might leave you vulnerable, I guess, or
Exactly, yeah.
So, okay. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you, Father Szada,
Well, thank
for
you.
being with us today.
Appreciate it.
This was really awesome.
And you all, you know how to reach me. If you ever have any other questions, feel free to contact me. I'll be happy to help in any way I can.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Good luck to everybody in your studies, and blessed Christmas to everybody.
Yes, thank you.